In this mini lecture, we're going to spend a little time talking about exactly how the graft union forms. So, here's how the graft union forms. The first thing that has to happen when you make your graft is there has to be intimate contact of a considerable amount of the cambial regions of the stalk and the scion under favorable environmental conditions. That means that when you make your grafting cuts, you do so in such a way that the vascular cambium is exposed both on the rootstock and the scion, and then when those two pieces are bound together, the vascular cambium of the rootstock needs to be very carefully lined up with the vascular cambium of the scion. When it says a considerable amount of the regions, it basically means the two vascular cambia of the two parts of your grafted plants need to be in direct physical contact with each other as much as possible. And then you typically bond them together in such a way that they won't shift or move around. Once that happens, the second thing that will occur is that there will be production and interlocking of parenchyma cells, that is callus, of both the stalk and the scion. So remember, the callus is made up of those undifferentiated parenchyma cells. And this is where I want to make a very important point. Sometimes people get confused with grafting and think because you're combining two plants into one, that somehow their genetics change, that they form some sort of hybrid. That's not what happens. The cells of the rootstock will continue to be genetically like the rootstock, and the cells of the scion will continue to genetically be like the cells of the scion forever. Okay. When I say forever, it makes me think of the movie The Sandlot, where they're talking about the big dog and they go, forever, forever. If you're like, what is she talking about? You need to go watch The Sandlot. Really, you do. Anyways, I digress. So, those cells are going to interlock, those callus cells, and then what's going to happen is step 3. The callus cells that are in line with the vascular cambia of the stalk and the scion are going to differentiate into cambial cells, which will give rise to the new vascular tissue. So basically, there's going to be a callus bridge made up of rootstock and scion cells that will differentiate into a vascular cambium, still made up of rootstock and scion cells. And then that vascular cambium, because it's a meristome, will produce new xylem and phloem, thus connecting your two pieces so that water, nutrients, and sugars can move in between the rootstock and scion. So that's how the graft union forms. And this picture just sort of schematically shows it to you. In these pictures, that dark black layer in each of the rootstocks and scions is the vascular cambium. So you can see the two pieces, the scion and the rootstock, the callus bridge that forms between them, and then what happens as the new vascular cambium begins to form between the two pieces, and then lastly the formation of the new xylem and phloem. So I'm not going to read that whole paragraph to you, but if you take some time studying this diagram, it's going to help cement the whole graft union formation process in your mind. So, what factors affect graft healing? Are there ways that we can ensure that the graft union forms more successfully? And by the way, in the picture here, this is a very old grafted tree. This is at Kew Gardens, and these are some of our students examining it. And so you can see here the graft union on this tree is very evident, very easy to see, because again, the scion piece just naturally grows to a much larger diameter and a much different type of bark than the rootstock piece. So the first factor that can affect graft healing is plant species. Some plants just naturally heal more quickly and more efficiently than others. The plant species that do that, the reason why is because they tend to produce more callus more quickly. And the more quickly that you can form that callus bridge, the more quickly it can differentiate into the new vascular cambium and produce new xylem and phloem. The other thing is, let's say that you did your graft, but you didn't quite line up the vascular cambium of your stalk with your scion as carefully as you should have. If you're using a species that just naturally produces a lot of callus, it's not quite as big of a deal because it'll produce enough callus to bridge that gap. If it's something that doesn't naturally produce a lot of callus, then you're going to have to be extra careful to line up the two vascular cambia. Peach trees are like this. They produce a lot of callus naturally, so are ginkgos, and that's actually why for the in-person class for horticulture majors, we usually have them graft ginkgos because they have a high rate of success because they produce so much callus and they heal a lot more quickly. The next bullet point you see there is grafting method. There are many different types of grafts, which we'll talk about in the next mini lecture. And for each species, sometimes even each cultivar, there's a particular grafting method that works best for grafting that plant. So for some plants, budding may work the best, for others, maybe a whip and tongue graft, etc. Environmental conditions. Temperature is not always a big deal for grafting, but for some plants, a high temperature around where the graft union is forming can cause it to form faster or can even be necessary. A good example of this are filberts or hazelnuts. Often they place a device around the graft union after the graft is made to basically provide heat, like a small miniature heater that surrounds it and keeps it at around 80 degrees Fahrenheit because heating the graft union of that particular species allows the graft union to form more quickly. Humidity, pretty much all grafted plants, you want to keep the graft union at as close to 100% humidity as possible. That's why when we perform a graft, we then cover it with something, either grafting wax, which seals in the moisture, or parafilm, which is sort of a stretchy plastic waxy material that you can wrap your graft union with, and that will again seal in the moisture. Soil moisture and oxygen, this just goes back to basic plant care. You don't want to let the plant dry out during the formation of the graft union. You want to make sure you keep it well watered, but you also want to make sure that it's not completely saturated because that's not going to be good for the health of the plant either. And then finally, the growth activity of the rootstock plant at the time of grafting is often important. Some types of grafts you can do any time of year and it'll work. But for a lot of the types of grafts that we'll discuss, it needs to be during a time when there's what we call good bark slippage. Bark slippage is basically just about how easy is it to peel back the bark of that plant. Because what's right beneath the bark of the plant? The vascular cambium. So remember, we're cutting back to the vascular cambium so we can line it up with the vascular cambium of the scion. So when there's good bark slippage, and this is typically happening during the active growth period of the plant, so in spring and early summer, particularly in spring, we have good bark slippage because what's happening is, in preparation for the growing season, the plant is producing large amounts of callus between the bark and the vascular cambium. So when you make your cut, there's already a lot of parenchyma cells there, ready to make the new vascular cambium, and it's also just much easier to make neat, clean cuts when there's good bark slippage because the bark is more separated from the vascular cambium at that time due to that layer of callus. So bark slippage is important for successful graft union formation in a lot of different types of plants. Compatibility also matters. You can't just graft any two plants together that you want to. I once had a student who asked me if you could graft marijuana onto bamboo. Now, while you're pondering that, the idea he had here is bamboo grows really fast and really vigorously. It just really takes over. Marijuana, apparently not so much. So if I can graft marijuana onto bamboo, I will get really fast-growing, vigorous marijuana. The logic is sound. The science is not. Those are nowhere close to related to each other, so you can't graft them together. Plants have to be fairly closely related in order to be grafted together, and so here in the picture I have our taxonomic structure again, the hierarchy. You pretty much cut it off at the genus level for compatibility. If it's not in the same genus, it usually doesn't work. There are some exceptions to that. We'll talk about it later. So, usually two plants are compatible for grafting if they are within the same clone or cultivar because they're genetically identical. This would be, for example, if you were doing repair grafting such as bridge grafting or inarcing, you'd probably use the exact same plant for that. Intraspecific means you're grafting two plants that are in the same species but not the same clone or cultivar. So, for example, our apples. So an intraspecific graft is going to be compatible. Now you'll notice that interspecific is listed both under compatible and incompatible. An interspecific graft is one where the stock and the scion are not the same species, but they are in the same genus. And it's sort of a toss-up. Half the time they're compatible, half the time they're not. It just depends. Moving into incompatible, again, we've discussed interspecific. Intergeneric is usually incompatible. An intergeneric graft, we are now using two plants that are not in the same genus or species, but they are in the same family. This is usually incompatible. We'll talk about some exceptions to that later. And then finally, we have interfamilial, and basically anything above that on our taxonomic hierarchy. So if they're not in the same family, but they are in the same order or class or phylum or kingdom, that's just not closely enough related for grafting to be successful. So here are some examples. The genus Prunus is the genus of plants that contains all of these food crops that you see listed here: almonds, apricots, peaches, plums, etc. If you recall the fruit cocktail tree that I showed in the previous mini lecture, you'll recall that one of those was one that contained species of plants in the genus Prunus. So here's an example of where we have interspecific compatibility for grafting. So these plants are not the same species, but they are in the same genus, the genus Prunus. So if you look at this diagram, the arrows indicate which way grafting can occur compatibly. So for example, with the almond and the peach, you can graft an almond scion onto a peach rootstock and that will work. You can also graft a peach scion onto an almond rootstock and that will work as well. However, this is not the case with peaches and apricots. I cannot graft a peach scion onto an apricot rootstock. They will not be compatible. It will not work. However, I can graft an apricot scion onto a peach rootstock. So in that case, it only goes one way. In yet another case, the almond and the apricot, they can't be grafted on each other at all. And here's where we can get into the whole idea of using an interstock as a compatibility bridge. If you look, you'll see that the peach is both compatible with the almond and the apricot if we're putting the apricot onto the peach. So if I use an almond rootstock, a peach interstock, and an apricot scion, that will work. It will be compatible because the peach is compatible with the almond rootstock and with the apricot scion, and so in this way we can combine all three of those things onto one plant. Now, I don't know why we do that, because if we're using almond as a rootstock, peach as an interstock, and apricot as the scion, we're still only going to get apricot fruits. But if you wanted to, you could do it. You'll notice that between the almond and the Japanese plum, we have some arrows that are dotted and it says partial. This means that it's dependent upon the specific cultivar. So certain cultivars of Japanese plum are compatible with almond and some are not. So that was an example of interspecific compatibility. Here's an example of intergeneric compatibility. So remember that I said this is rarely compatible, but sometimes it is. And here's an example. These plants, the pear, hawthorn, apple, quince, and photinia, which is an ornamental plant, they are all in different genera. I have the genera listed and then their common name below it. Photinia doesn't have a common name below it, but usually it's just called photinia, or in some cases red tip. Right? But you can see they are all in different genera, but they are still all in the same family. They're all still in the rose family. So again, even though they are not in the same genus, some of them can be grafted together and it will be compatible. And again, let's look at our whole idea of an interstock here. Pears and apples are not compatible with each other. We can't graft them together. However, they are both compatible with the hawthorn. So I could put an apple and a pear together in one grafted plant if I used a hawthorn interstock. Now you'll notice there's a question mark between the quince and the photinia. That's because no one has really done enough research on it to see if those are compatible with each other or not. And there's not a good reason to try it. Photinia has a lot of disease problems, so it doesn't make a good rootstock. Also, it has non-edible fruits and very bad smelling flowers, so it doesn't make a good scion either. So there's just not really any good reason to cross it with a quince.